Thanks, Ezra. Appreciate you inviting me along this afternoon. So my name is James Willans. I've worked in a broad spectrum of industries, ranging from small startup companies with one or two other people, all the way through to big global organizations like HSBC. And I've done many different things. My career really started in the technology space as a technologist, building out technologies, working with standards bodies like the Object Management Group to set software standards, building products, leading the delivery of products. When I joined HSBC around about 8, 9 years ago, my mode shifted at that point, Ezra. I moved from being a technologist that understood technology to working really within the area of what we would loosely call digital transformation. So putting in place strategy centered around technology change and executing that. So, for example, within HSBC, one of the big initiatives I was involved in was the architecture of digital platform, which was a new generation digital platform to deliver global propositions for HSBC. That's gathered a lot of momentum actually over recent years. That now hosts 15 global markets for internet and mobile banking. It supports stock trading in Hong Kong, which is a high frequency application, supports customer onboarding for Hong Kong and the UK. So that's an example of a transformation I was involved in HSBC. More recently, I worked for a company in Leeds called Larsa Limited that delivers software products for the pharmaceutical industry. And again, I went into that organization and put in place a technology transformation strategy that we executed over 3 years, which saw a lot of change. We put in place architecture practices and shape and structure maturity around architecture. The technology platforms that were being used were revamped, put in place new product architectures and platforms. We changed the way that products were delivered from being shrink wrap products to delivering those on cloud as software as a service, and many other changes as well. So my mode of operation is very much within that digital transformation space and going into organizations, understanding a future state and helping them move towards that future state. In September, I'm moving into a new role for me, working in that consulting space for a company called the DMW Group. And I'm going to be leaning on my experience and hopefully bringing that to a diverse set of clients to help with their digital transformation initiatives.
Brilliant. So you've got an exciting journey ahead of you. And I think having that digital transformation background, particularly now, as you've highlighted in the article, that sort of first prompted this is going to be invaluable almost, because of course, the clients that I'm speaking to, if you ask them about how they see their future and how their organization is going to progress, it's a new world for a lot of people. And of course, digital transformation is at the heart of that. So it'd be interesting to sort of delve into that article a little bit more and really hear what you're hearing and get your thoughts.
Yeah, well, it's been an interesting period, I guess, for everyone, but particularly for me. I finished my last role around about March, and as I've just mentioned, I don't start my new role to September. So I've been in a very luxurious position where I've been able to really kind of observe from a distance the fallout from COVID for businesses, and really have a lot of conversations with people at the coalface and try and assimilate a view of what's happening. And it's been really interesting to try and analyze and put together the bits of information I've been getting back. But what's interesting is how we've gone through different phases of response to COVID within businesses. So I think the initial response was very much one of shock and awe. Business leaders were really struggling to understand how they responded to COVID. And I think that was because, Ezra, it was changing on a day-by-day basis. It wasn't just a single disastrous event on a day that could then be assimilated over a number of weeks. It was something that unfolded and continues to unfold on a day-by-day basis. So business leaders were really struggling to get to grips with it and understand it. But I think they did. And I think the view was very much at that stage, we just need to keep operating. We need to keep our heads above water. We need to very much survive. Then that gave way to another phase where they were very much thinking about how do we bridge this gap between where we are now and the old normality returning. But I think most recently the conversations have been telling me that there's now a realization that the old normality is not going to return, that actually the new normal is very much constant change. The lack of stability, the lack of stability and understanding the environment that business is operating is very much the new normal that they must operate within.
No, you're absolutely right, and I think LinkedIn have quite timely put in polls. And if you look at any LinkedIn page at the moment, people are asking, will you be returning to the office full time? Will you be 50-50? What do you want to do? And it's astounding when you look at these figures that most people do not want to return to the office 5 days a week. They want that element of flexibility, or they want to be working fully remotely. And of course, for businesses, if you've never worked as a fully remote business, how do you shift? How do you change that business strategy, and how do you actually put in the infrastructure to uphold that? So it's very interesting. And there was an article recently which is actually referred by someone who commented on your article, I think. I just can't remember who, but it was talking about architecture around digital transformation, and it was about actually an architect can set a blueprint for you for your digital transformation, especially now. So is that something that you've done in the past? Or where do you see the role of architecture fitting into digital transformation?
I think it's like so many disciplines and capabilities within organizations. I think they need to evolve and adapt to the new way of operating, because as you rightly identify, internally the environment's changing. So the way that staff are working, where staff are sourced from, because of course having people that are moving to a more remote working model allows you to source staff from not only all over the country but all over the world, is another dimension. And of course technology, as we've seen today, the technology used to collaborate. But of course the other big dimension, and the really instigated by uncertainty, is how companies are expected to work with their customers. So the expectations of customers are changing, the way that services are being delivered, the engagement models are changing, and all of that has ramifications on the operating model of organizations. And all capabilities need to adapt, and architecture is a key capability that needs to think differently about the way it delivers what it does. And I think the new normal very much demands an agile response where the direction of travel can be adjusted, tweaked, and in some cases change on a day-by-day basis as new things are coming out of the woodwork within the environment the company operates. And I think that's a very different way of thinking about the world to traditional architecture. Traditional architecture is very much about belt and braces, dotting the I's, crossing the T's, being very, very thorough. And the way that that's been achieved has been a very methodical, sometimes quite top-down way of incrementally refining something from the top level, going through a lot of stages to get to the detail. While that's great, it's also expensive and it takes time. And that doesn't particularly well fit with the new world that we're speaking about, Ezra. So I think at a high level, architecture needs to be much more agile, and it needs to be much less risk averse and more open to failure, because that's the way businesses are wanting to operate. They're wanting to move faster with an acceptance of failure. So rather than going through all of these different stages to make sure that the architecture that's being delivered is thorough and absolutely fit for purpose, I think architects need to be thinking differently and understanding what is essential to achieve what we need to achieve. What are the key risks within what we're delivering that are ultimately going to make or break this, and zooming into those, accepting that other dimensions might be done in a more evolutionary way. So I think being more comfortable with risk is one dimension of how architecture needs to change. I think another dimension, and I think this is crucial, Ezra, is the mode of how architects operate. I think they need to become closer to the domain. They need to understand the domain to a much greater extent than they did. They need to be able to, almost independent of the business, understand how the shaping environment, may impact what they're doing, so that when they're shaping the architecture, they're able to understand the opportunities and risks without necessarily doing that blindly or being reliant on the business to shape that for them. So I think, at a high level, architecture needs to be more agile. It needs to understand what the key dimensions are that are really going to affect the success or otherwise of delivery. And they need to be close to the domain so that they can really understand that at a level of detail.
No, I think those are some really good points, and particularly on the need to be more agile. There was a video I did with Tom Clements, who's chief architect at On the Beach, and they are naturally, they're a digital business, they're pure play. So everything that they have to do, it needs to be quick. It can't be held back by a traditional architecture. So quite interestingly, he was talking about his approach, and it is all about enabling businesses to move as quickly as possible, enabling the tech teams to make the decisions without architecture putting up a blocker. So it'd be interesting to hear your view on how would you achieve that within larger organizations, maybe organizations that don't, agile doesn't come naturally to them.
I think there are many different approaches, and I think it depends on the organization. But an approach that I think has a lot of value is, and it relates to what I was saying about risk, a risk-based approach. And rather than traditional architecture, which kind of starts with the logical architecture, refines it to the physical deployments and so on, and then somewhere towards the end talks about the risks and how those risks are mitigated, to actually to some extent put all of the other stuff to one side and just focus as a starting point on the risks, right? So it might be for a particular system, the risks are, can the system scale to support X number of customers? Can it be delivered by a particular date? Crucial in this kind of agile, fast-moving world. Can the system adapt to support potentially X and Y in the future? Okay. And then working with the business, having understood those risks, to then drive the architecture, just focus on those risks, right? To a large extent, forget about the other dimensions, not because they're not important, but because they're probably less important than the risks, and then drive it through the risks. And what you achieve by doing that is you're focusing on what is essential in a very agile way, and able to move much quicker, but also you're able to have a much more sensible conversation with the business, because the business don't understand logical physical deployments and so on. It's just nice PowerPoints and fancy diagrams to them to an extent, whereas risks done properly should be something very real. So risks for me are twofold. They make for a very meaningful conversation with the business, but also they mean that we can focus as architects on what is essential in order to deliver success.
Great. Those some great points, and certainly some things for people to take away. So I appreciate I've probably taken you down a bit of a rabbit hole with architecture. So if we focus more on that digital transformation piece, if you were speaking to a business leader, someone who is a CEO or managing director who's making these decisions, what would you say to them? What would be the first steps for them to take?
I think what's essential and what often gets overlooked is understanding what the endpoint is at a level of detail, Ezra. So I think very quickly the focus is on the journey. What do we need to do in order to transform? And sometimes the conversations I have are, isn't the endpoint obvious? Isn't it obvious why we're doing whatever it is we're doing? And actually, there's some truth in that, right? At a 40,000 foot view, it does make sense to be trying to achieve the outcome that the business leaders are looking to achieve. But for me, what makes or breaks transformation is having a much greater level of clarity around those outcomes, a much greater level of measures, because without them, what you're doing is introducing ambiguity to the journey. Whenever there's ambiguity, there's confusion. Whenever there's confusion, there's a lack of pace. So having absolute clarity about the outcomes that you want to achieve at the end of the transformation program is essential. And decoupling those from the journey is a second point, because if you understand your outcomes as a first step, you can then explore alternative approaches of achieving those outcomes and compare and contrast. If you start coupling the journey and the outcomes together, then everything becomes a bit of a muddle. So to answer your question, my guidance to business leaders wanting to do any kind of transformation is understand at a level of detail what your outcomes are and put some key measures around those outcomes.
No, fantastic. Well, I think we've covered a fair bit, but is there anything else that you feel people should know that would support them on their journey?
Well, I think there's lots to say. There are lots of challenges. There are lots of different dimensions that need to be considered. But fundamentally, to the last point that I made, I think anything, however complex, can be simplified. And the way that we simplify, going back to my engineering days, is to break big challenges into smaller challenges. So my advice to any business leader is, as confusing as a direction might look right now, break the challenges into much smaller units, break them into outcomes, use something like OKRs to understand ultimately where you want to end up, and then work using those as a framework on the journeys and the different opportunities that you have to achieve those outcomes. You can explore whether you want to use internal capability, external capability, a combination of both, off the shelf, build your own. There are lots of options, but ultimately without the clarity and without breaking big problems down into smaller problems, it can become very difficult to make headway.
No, brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time, James. If anyone does have any questions or anything further to add, then do, as always, drop something in the comments. And yeah, thank you again.
Yeah, appreciate talking to you, Ezra.